What we're going to talk about today is we're just going to talk a little bit about Zerto virtual replication and how we can help you migrate or replicate or protect workloads up into AWS. I'm going to start off with two short introductions. First being me. My name's Jason Calloway. I'm a systems engineer here for Zerto. I cover both the enterprise and cloud business for the ANZ region. Previous to coming to Zerto, I worked at a cloud service provider based out in Sydney who leveraged Zerto actually for their DR as a service offerings. And then prior to that, I was a subject matter expert for, some of you may know the company called Platespin, for roughly about 7 years in the APJ region. So have a bit of a background in the DR and data transformation space. The second introduction I'm going to do is Zerto. So for those of you who don't know who Zerto is or what we do, we provide enterprise class virtual replication, migration, and disaster recovery services for on-premise and up to the cloud. So we are very much a hypervisor-based, hardware-agnostic, fully software replication and orchestration and DR solution. So what we're going to go through during this little presentation here, we're going to go through, why would we be migrating to AWS? We're going to cover, what are some of the cost benefits that you might get out of either moving production workloads up into AWS or leveraging it as a secondary data center for protecting your environment. How do we actually get there? So what are the steps or what are the things we have to consider when looking to move things up into the cloud? And then, how we can help in just a few steps to actually accomplish the goal of moving things up there. And then we're gonna finish things off with a short demo just to show you how easy it is and how quickly we can recover workloads up into AWS. So when we look at data centers and infrastructure and really IT in general, a lot has changed really in the last, I would say, 15 or 20 years, right? When we're taking a look at traditional data centers, traditional infrastructure, we really were tied very much to a physical environment originally, right? And this isn't going really that far back. That environment was great. We got a lot, it gave us a lot of capability, but it was also pretty restrictive. There wasn't a lot of flexibility and agility that we were able to gain out of those environments. Now, when we saw the inception of virtualization and really the main, mainstream adoption of virtualization, we saw a huge shift in the way that we were able to, perform, IT from an organizational perspective and an operational perspective. We were able to gain huge cost benefits by being able to consolidate physical workloads into a virtual environment. And then when we added that software-defined data center layer on top of it, we gained a huge amount of flexibility and huge amount of agility that we just weren't able to get when we were sitting inside of a physical environment. So it was a huge, I think, paradigm shift in the way that we were able to perform IT tasks. Now, when we look at kind of where we are now, and which is probably part of the reason why we're all sitting in this room, is with the mainstream now adoption of hybrid cloud, public cloud services and infrastructure, we're seeing another really big shift. Not only were we with virtualization able to consolidate our physical workloads, now we can almost completely get rid of them, right? We can get rid of production data centers. We can get rid of secondary data centers and actually have things running in the cloud where you can access them really from anywhere in the world. And for me, it's a huge change. It's a huge shift. I think it's really akin to the virtualization switch that we made. And I think a big reason why I would say that is because most companies that we talk to, most organizations that we work with now, I don't think a single one of them is not looking at leveraging public cloud services in some way. So it's a really huge shift for us. Now, when we start to kind of focus a little bit, and we want to talk a little bit about disaster recovery, when organizations are looking at leveraging some form of disaster recovery solution or some BCP strategy inside of their environment, there's really two main options that most organizations are looking at. The first being what I would call the traditional approach, which is maintaining a physical, warm data center that has physical resources that we have to leverage in order to protect one environment to another. And then the second option is again, probably the reason why we're all sitting in this room, which is to leverage something like AWS, a public cloud platform, to be able to decommission and remove the cost and management and overhead of having to maintain a secondary data center. So when we actually look at the different options, there's a lot of things that organizations have to weigh up to determine which method they want to actually go through. So, if we talk about a DIY data center, do-it-yourself data center, or a dedicated disaster recovery site, there are a lot of things that we have to take into consideration. High costs, like-for-like infrastructure. We got to keep the lights on. So we have to pay for licensing. We have to do all kinds of stuff. It costs organizations a huge amount of money, and in a lot of instances, it's just for your insurance policy. Okay, you're not actually leveraging it for anything other than just to protect yourself in case something happens. Okay, so it's a huge amount of cost and a huge amount of management overhead to be able to just maintain an insurance policy. Okay, probably one of the biggest things that hits home with me, having worked, in data center transformation, and data center migration projects for a very long time. One of the hardest type projects that we had to go through, and things to consider when we were weighing up what we wanted to use as a platform, was how do we scale our environment to be able to handle not only the performance requirements that you have for your current services and current applications that are running, but also how do we forecast for the changes that may happen within your environment over the next 5-10 years, right? One thing I found with performing these tasks was that they were usually really, really easy to get wrong and really, really hard to get right. And a lot of that had to do with unforeseen changes. You could, a simple platform change can throw out all your forecasting numbers. An acquisition of another company could cause you to, not have forecasted enough resources to be able to handle the new onset of the new environment that you have to bring into your environment. So what I found with this is that it was really difficult. It's really hard to get the data to do this, and in a lot of instances, you do the best you can, but you ended up being on the wrong side of the coin. Now, when we start to talk about the second option, which is going to the cloud, there's in my opinion, a lot of huge advantages of leveraging something like AWS as a disaster recovery platform, and as well as an actual, primary data center where you can run your production workloads. Obviously, cost becomes such a huge factor here. You actually have the capability of being able to decommission an entire physical environment, move it into a cloud environment, and take it from a CapEx cost to an OpEx cost, which a lot of organizations like a lot better these days. Again, from my personal experience being a bit more on the techie side, the ability to almost entirely get rid of the exercises surrounding capacity planning is fantastic, right? I mean, having the capability of being able to, on demand, at a click of a button, ramp up your resources or reduce your resources as your workloads need them and as your organization see fits is in my opinion, such a huge advantage of leveraging a cloud platform like AWS. So kind of going along that same strain, this slide is just going to kind of tell you a little bit about some of the actual cost savings that you can achieve by leveraging a platform like AWS. Now, the information that we actually got here and some of the values that we got here were actually provided by using a tool that AWS themselves provide to us. They have an ROI calculator that you can actually go online, you can check yourself, and you can punch in your own details into, and it really provides you a really great idea and comparison of resources you're using and potential cost savings that you can get from transferring off. I really would encourage you guys to take a look at it. It's a really, really good tool. But as you can see here, the costs that it takes for you to have upkeep of an actual DIY data center, an actual disaster recovery site that's just a warm site, is pretty astronomical. When you move things off to a public cloud, I mean, DR site management at all, it's just completely gone. I mean, you don't have to really worry about it because it's sitting up in the cloud. And one of the funniest things I find about this slide is that this doesn't even include your rack space, your cooling, and your power consumption that you have. So it's pretty significant savings that you can get from moving from the on-premise platform into a public cloud like AWS. Sounds good, right? I think it sounds pretty good. Something that I'd be liking to look at. But how do we actually do this, though? Right? I mean, it's all well and good to be able to cut costs and to gain more agility and more flexibility in your environment, but how do we actually do that? And with most organizations that we talk to, we find that there's really about three main things that we have to figure out and get our heads around before we're able to achieve this successfully. So the first one is really transforming, right? So what we're doing now is we're taking applications, we're taking operating systems, and we're taking from a platform that they were designed to run in, which is your virtualization layer, whether it's vSphere or Hyper-V or whatever it is that you're running, and we're now moving it into an entirely new platform. Okay, how do we do that? It's a complex task in most situations. Having to actually convert and transition from one platform to the next can be very difficult. Not only is it complex, it can also be very time-consuming. We don't want, in moving from one platform to the next, from an on-premise to a cloud environment, we want to reduce the amount of downtime, the amount of risk involved in doing that. So these are one of the first things that we have to look at. The second thing is almost every single organization that we talk to these days has a cloud-first strategy, okay, which means they want to take something, they want to use cloud services in one way or the other. The biggest thing that we find, though, is what does that actually mean to that organization? Does it mean, do we just take applications wholesale and throw them up into the cloud and hope for the best? Okay, or do we pick and choose strategic services, strategic applications, place them into the cloud, see how they're going to run, right? And then in order to do that, how do we do that with the least amount of impact to your production environment, with the least amount of risk involved in doing that? Okay? How do we test this environment without impacting your production environment? How do you see how much it's going to cost us to run, your SQL environment up in AWS? Okay? There are a lot of factors that we have to take into consideration before we just start to wholesale move things around. And then migration. Okay? So actually going through the project of taking production workloads, throwing them up in the cloud, and getting them actually to run up there. How do we do that with the least amount of risk and the least amount of complexity? So with Zerto, we can actually help you do everything, and we can actually help you do it relatively easily. So from a Zerto perspective, there's really two main use cases for migration. One is to, like we mentioned, is to actually remove the need for a disaster recovery site. So you can completely decommission your secondary site that you're using for protecting your environment. And the next one is to actually remove your production environment. So we're actually going to take your machines, your core critical servers, we're going to place them in AWS, and that's where they're going to run from now on. So how do we do that? And we can really help you achieve that in really just a few steps. It's actually fairly straightforward how we do this. So step one. What we need to do is we actually have to prepare the environment. Okay? So as these steps go, I'm just going to kind of describe to you from the on-prem side of things, from the network side of things, and then to the cloud and the different components that we have to deploy. So with this part, we'll discuss a little bit more about what we have to deploy on-premise. So the first component that we would have to deploy in your environment is something called the ZVM, or Zerto Virtual Manager. Okay, now this is a virtual machine that we deploy into your environment. Okay, all of our components that we deploy are fully software-based, so we have no requirement whatsoever for physical infrastructure. Okay, and that's from your storage layer all the way up to your compute layer. Excuse me. Now, the Zerto Virtual Manager basically acts as your administrative and management portal for Zerto. So this is where we go to initiate replication. This is where we go to create virtual protection groups. This is where we go to pretty much do anything inside the world of Zerto. And it plugs in and integrates very directly and very tightly with your virtual management layer. So whether that's SCVMM or whether that's your vCenter environment. And allow us to do that so that we can provide the lowest amount of intrusion and interruption to your environment. Second component that we would deploy is something called a VRA, or a virtual replication appliance. Now, the virtual replication appliance, again, is just the virtual machine that we deploy to all of your virtual hosts inside of your environment. And this is really what's facilitating the replication of data from your production site to your secondary site, whether that's for means of replication for protection or whether that means for actually migrating servers. Now, we achieve this via I/O mirroring. Okay, so we don't leverage snapshotting, we don't schedule, and we don't use storage for replication. All right, now, once we've deployed those initial components into your production environment, into your on-premise production environment, the second step that we need to do is actually configure connectivity up into AWS, okay? So up into your VPC in AWS. There's a couple different methods that we support in order to do that. So we can utilize a VPN connection up into your VPC in AWS, or we can leverage your direct connect connection up into AWS as well. So either of those are fully supported. Minimum requirement for bandwidth is 5 megabit per second, but you know, across things like direct connects that are a little bit more robust, a little bit more bandwidth, we actually can achieve some extremely aggressive RPOs. Currently, we have many customers right now who are achieving anywhere between 1 to 5 second RPOs. Completely out of this our software-based solution. So it's pretty aggressive what we can achieve there. Step 3, and this is actually the last component really that we have to deploy, and this is something called a ZCA, or a Zerto Cloud Appliance. Now, Zerto Cloud Appliance is a M4 extra large EC2 instance that we deploy up into the cloud. It's very important that you understand that this is the only perpetually running compute resource that we require when leveraging Zerto. Okay? As we replicate your protected workloads up into AWS, we do not require standby EC2 instances to be running accepting replication traffic. All of that traffic goes directly into S3 buckets. So the only time you ever need to leverage your compute resources up in AWS is when you do either a failover or if you're testing your environment up in AWS. Okay, so it becomes quite cost effective for you. Step 4. So once we've actually deployed all the components, we are connected, we can communicate back and forth between the two environments. The next step that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and configure replication up into your VPC. Okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use something called a virtual protection group in order to do that. So a virtual protection group is one of the most important constructs within Zerto. And what that is it's our implementation of a consistency group. All right? So what this allows us to do, in essence, is it allows us to take your virtual machines, we can group them together. All of the dependent servers that are a part of your application, we can group them together and we can replicate them as an application, as a whole, from your prod site to either your new site or to your DR site. All right? So within the constructs of that virtual protection group, we can apply boot ordering, we can apply global settings to that environment, and we can actually even apply priority to the different virtual protection groups. But probably the most important thing that we achieve is actual consistency across your application that's being protected within that virtual protection group. So when we recover virtual machines via the virtual protection group, we don't just boot virtual machines and then you have to go ahead and do a bunch of reconfiguration in order to make an application online. We actually bring an entire application online to an exact point in time across all of the virtual machines that are part of that virtual protection group in a consistent way. And what we do to achieve that is we maintain something called write order fidelity from the production site to your DR site. So we keep track of the order in which writes are going into all of your dependent virtual machines. We duplicate them to the DR site. We create a point in time that's aligned to every single server inside of that virtual protection group. So when we recover, the whole application is available. Okay, so RTO for us means application availability. Step 5, and pretty much the final step that we would go through, is to actually now use Zerto to do all the fun things that you might want it to do, right? So we're going ahead. We've already replicated up into AWS. When we replicate, we're continuous data replication, so we're always sending data. So one of the first things you probably would want to do is test your environment. So whether you're moving production permanently up into AWS or whether you're utilizing it for a disaster recovery site, testing your environment is key, especially with DR. We always say that if you're not testing your DR strategy, you don't have a DR strategy. Okay, so it's very important to do this. Now, with our technology and our point-in-time recovery capabilities and our journaling capability, we actually have the capability of taking all of your virtual machines, powering them up inside of an isolated environment, testing them to your heart's content, while we maintain replication from production during the test. So while you're testing your environment, we are still replicating. So you're never, ever not protected with our product, okay? If you are in the middle of a DR test and you need to actually fail over because you've had an outage, just initiate the failover. It'll be to the last checkpoint inside of our journal, which is roughly about, could it be 1 second ago? And you're back up and running within minutes, okay? So things like compliance, if you have SLA compliance regulations on top of you that say, you know what, we have to achieve 15-minute or 5-minute RPOs at all times, okay? With our product, you will, even when you're testing. We have some built-in reports. This is an example of one of them here. Now, I think our built-in CAN reports are fairly good. I think they give you a lot of information. But I think the main power of Zerto when it comes to reporting really stems from our REST API set that we have. So we have a full REST API set that not only allows you to build reports, but it also allows you to fully automate everything about Zerto. But if you have an external reporting solution that you're leveraging inside of your environment, you can go ahead and plug directly into our APIs and really build your own custom reports that allow you to show whatever you want. And then one of the final things we'll talk about is something called a move. So for our terminology, a move basically is a migration, okay? Or what I like to call a controlled failover. And really what we do with a move or a migration is we replicate in all the same ways. We still have the same capability of testing your environment. But the main thing is that we gracefully power down production servers and we gracefully power on new servers. We reconfigure those servers regardless of whether you want to keep an IP or change an IP or run a script or whatever it is that you might want to do with those target machines. And we do that in a fully automated and orchestrated way. So that's how we're able to pretty much do everything that you needed to from your on-prem up into AWS. So we're just going to go through a really quick demo. It's only a few minutes. I am, as you probably can tell, not conducting the demo. It's a recorded demo, so I'll just talk to it as we go through. So this is the UI for Zerto. It's actually fairly straightforward. It's an HTML5 UI. And what we're doing is we're going to go through an actual failover. So when we go through a failover, first step we have to do is press the big red button in the corner. And then we go into a place where we choose the different VPGs as well as choose the different checkpoints from within our journal that we want to recover to. So I mentioned a little bit that we have journaling capability. So our point-in-time recovery capability can go back as far as 30 days into the past at a granularity of whatever your RPO is. So if you're achieving 1 second RPO, you're going to have a lot of data points that can go as far back as 30 days. Now, once we've chosen that, the next step was just to press that button that you saw there on the screen. And what that does is it goes ahead and it'll initiate the automation and orchestration to power on your virtual machines up in AWS. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in the background, but from an administrative perspective, that's all you had to do. Okay, so it makes it quite easy to create runbooks and things like that if you are leveraging this for DR. Okay. As you can see, up in your AWS console inside of your tenancy, you can see the virtual machines actually starting to power on. We've assigned it a private IP address that we're able to communicate with now. Okay, so through our orchestration and automation, we can, by default out of the box, change all of your network configuration. And from a bespoke perspective, we can also initiate the running of scripts up in either pre-replication or post-replication as well. So there's quite a bit of things that you can do from a customization perspective. For instance, if you do have to change an IP, you can automate the process of reconfiguring your application so that they will come up pointing to the new IP and run and be available once the servers come online. So once you've gone ahead and you've done your testing and everything looks great, all we have to do is go ahead and stop the test failover. Okay? So when we stop it, you have a chance to put in some notes to see whether it succeeded or failed. Now, these notes will be placed into a report that you can generate to keep track of your DR testing, whether they were successful or not. And then all we have to do is go ahead and click stop. Now, once we've clicked stop, again, this part is completely automated as well. So what we're doing now is we're unmounting those EBS volumes that we imported from S3. We're going to break down the EC2 instance that we were leveraging to test that environment. And then we're just going to continue maintaining replication to the S3 buckets where most of our data is being stored. All of this stuff happens completely automatically. And the way that we leverage this, the way that we're actually able to do this is by integrating directly with the APIs up in AWS. So we're actually communicating with the APIs in AWS. We're making calls for all of this stuff to happen. So we're orchestrating it, and AWS itself is driving it. Okay? So it's quite, it's really easy. I think it's honestly one of the easiest replication technologies easily I've worked with. It's literally a couple screens that we have to go through, as you saw, to initiate a replication, a test failover or a failover. Anyway, that's really all I had for you today. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope that was really helpful. If you have any questions at all, please stop by the booth. I'll be there. We have a great team out there that'll be able to help you and answer any questions you have. Other than that, hey, enjoy the rest of the conference, guys. Thank you very much.